Good afternoon. It's Thursday, July 16th at noon, and that means it's time for another installment of Bites and Bits of History here at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society. This popular program is sponsored by the John and Loretta Hines Foundation, who have been most generous in the campaign for the Tyler Mahoning Valley History Center, and we appreciate their support and are proud to have them as sponsors of this program. Before we get started, I want to list some upcoming events. The Tyler History Center is now open to the public for tours, limited availability on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from noon to 4 p.m. We ask that you call ahead to make a reservation in order to maintain occupancy and social distancing and policy guidelines. The Arms Family Museum and Business and Media Archives will reopen to the public in August. Before I introduce today's speaker, here's some upcoming events. In our History to Go series, we have the Fifth Avenue Walking Tour, and that will be a virtual walking tour of the upper part of Fifth Avenue between Crandall Park and Gypsy Lane. That will premiere online on Saturday, July 25th. In August, we have the Amazing History Race, a mixture of in-person and online elements, which will be held August 22nd. Participants will get the clue information online and submit their images via email or text, and then we'll have a socially distanced tailgate party at the Tyler History Center following the competition. Another program that's running right now in July is the Hands-on History at Your House. And this is an online history challenge that comes out every Wednesday through August 5th. And the open houses will go virtual this year with historical information and activities and a coordinated museum challenge. All these programs and opening dates are subject to change. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Roslyn Torella. Roslyn grew up in Lowellville, Ohio, where her family has lived for more than a century. She is a 1984 graduate of Lowellville High School and holds degrees from Youngstown State University. She currently lives in Frederick County, Maryland, where she works as an anti-fraud senior technical advisor for the federal government. In 2018, Roslyn published her first book about the history of Lowellville, titled Lowellville, Ohio: Murders, Mayhem, and More. She has sold over 700 copies, and since she sold a copy to nearly every family in Lowellville, she insists that it makes her the #1 best-selling author on Lowellville's best-selling author list. Roslyn considers herself to be a self-appointed unofficial town historian of Lowellville. She has a passion for both genealogy and local history and writes monthly Italian genealogy column for La Gazzetta Italiana and local history stories for the Hometown Journal. So it is my great pleasure once again to introduce Roslyn Torella, who will talk about her book, Lowellville, Ohio: Murders, Mayhem, and More.
Thank you, Bill, for that lovely introduction, and also thank you to the Mahoning Valley Historical Society for having me here today. And also, I want to thank those of you at home who are joining online to view my presentation. I hope you will enjoy hearing about what a wicked little town Lowellville, Ohio once was. Most of what you're going to hear today are stories from my book that Bill mentioned earlier. First, I want to tell you a little bit about my book and how I came to be writing it. To write my book, I did hundreds and hundreds of hours of research, mostly in old newspapers, and the more I read about Lowellville's wicked past, the more I was amazed. The Lowellville I was reading about was nothing like the peaceful little village I grew up in the 1970s and 1980s. When we think of Lowellville today, we think of a pretty little village nestled along the Mahoning River that hosts a festival, fireworks display, and our famous baby doll dance every July, a tradition that has been around for 125 years. As some of you may have heard, though, it has been canceled this year due to the coronavirus pandemic. Lowellville is also known for its good Italian restaurants like Carcetti's Cafe and Melillo Station Grill. The latter houses a century-old former hotel. On top of the hill, we have a lovely winery, the L'Uva Bella, and we are also the birthplace of Di Russo sausage, which was first made on Lowellville's south side by one of the many Italian immigrant families that settled there. On Mondays in the summertime, our Water Street is lined with classic and vintage sports cars and trucks, which come from all over the valley to participate in that weekly car show. We have a wonderful school system, affordable homes, and a low crime rate. There are many families who have put down deep roots and who have been here for over a century, just like mine. As wonderful as Lowellville is now, that's not the Lowellville I'm going to be telling you about today. So let me give you a little bit more history. As I mentioned, I grew up in Lowellville, and my family settled there in the late 1890s after immigrating from Italy. My grandmother, Giovanna Di Domenico Torella, my aunts Pasqualine Torella Pantana, and Mary Torella Borage Arby, and my father, David Torella, were wonderful storytellers. And they would often tell me stories about what Lowellville was like when they were growing up, or stories that they had heard about Lowellville when they were children. Of course, I loved hearing these stories. In 2013, I was looking for a gift for my dad's 84th birthday. I was having a hard time figuring out what to get him since he really didn't want anything or need anything in particular. Hey, he had stopped drinking by that time, so the standby bottle of whiskey wasn't going to work anymore as a birthday gift. Then I remembered all those Lowellville stories that I heard about, and I decided to research those stories and organize them into a book. Well, that's what I did, and my father absolutely loved that book. I shared it with others, and they loved that book. So several people who had read about it encouraged me to actually publish it. And after 5 long years in the making, I self-published that book in 2018. That book is very different than any typical local history book that you might read, in that it's written by including the actual text from newspaper articles from the 1850s to the early 1920s. I love the way reporters wrote back then when they told their stories. The words they used, their wit, their sarcasm, it was definitely evident. And in those days, it was often called yellow journalism, and the details published were sometimes quite sensational. People would probably get sued today for some of the stuff the way they published back then. To add my personal touch to the stories, I did additional research on the events or the people in the stories. I'm a genealogist and a family historian, so it really was a natural process for me to add these historical footnotes to the stories where I could find more information through my search. As a result, this book and the research I have been doing in the village of Lowellville, I now have proclaimed myself to be the self-appointed, unofficial village historian. All right, I didn't have a whole lot of competition. So I hope you will enjoy the stories I'm going to be sharing with you today, and I decided I would pick a few of my favorites. The Lowellville of the late 19th century and 20th century had a number of murders, many unsolved. We had crooks, we had adulterers, we had brothels, we had lots of booze, and we had disastrous fires. But we also had hardworking villagers, heroes, brave police officers, and citizens who loved their village and who dedicated their lives to making it a good place to call home. As with anything, there is always good and bad, but it's usually the bad that makes the newspapers. Sometimes I get a little bit of criticism because all I write about is the bad stuff, and I have to explain it's because that's what I find written in the written record. Lowellville officially became Lowellville when it was incorporated in 1890. Before that, it was actually 2 villages, McGillsville, also known as McGill's Mill, named for John McGill, and Lowell. Lowellville's heydays were between the years of 1900s and the 1920s, and they were fueled by booze. More on that later. The first story I'm going to tell you about in the book is about Lowellville's 1904 street fair. Many of you are familiar with our Mount Carmel festival normally held in July that I mentioned earlier. But back in 1904, that was considered the Italians' festival. And the local businessmen wanted to host a street fair to help promote their businesses and also to promote the town. In the early 1900s, Lowellville really was a bustling little town. Our Water Street, which is parallel to the river, had a number of businesses and even hotels. Other business areas were Liberty Street and Washington Street on the south side. The street fair was held on Water Street. To prepare for the fair, the villagers spiffed up their homes, the businesses hung banners, and they made their place look the best it had ever looked. Making a good impression on the thousands of anticipated visitors was important to them. The ladies of the town cooked food to feed their fairgoers. Attractions were brought in to entertain. And remember, this was 1904, so entertainment back then is much different than what we would have now. There was a hot air balloon that was tethered to a rope that would ascend over the village a few times per day. There were acrobats, high wire walkers, Hindu sword swallowers, and knife throwers. bohemian jugglers, and bands playing from the bandstands, snake eaters, a nightly fireworks display, and there were even vaudeville shows. The town strung electric lights across Water Street, and even a couple were married during the fair. The streetcar line brought visitors from all over the Mahoning Valley and nearby Lawrence County, Pennsylvania. The Newcastle News provided this description. Lowellville will be a mecca for pleasure seekers, the big street fair through which the medium of the world is to hear of Lowellville and to become acquainted with the town's good qualities. The organizers wanted to put Lowellville on the map. Well, they certainly succeeded in putting Lowellville in the headlines. The day after the fair opened, tongues were wagging all over the valley about Lowellville Street Fair. The Newcastle News reported on the fair. In one of the shows, according to the statements of two men to a reporter, two women danced the hoochie coochie in the altogether, while only a short distance away, a negress clad in only a bathrobe stood on a platform while a barker announced that she would cast off that garment before doing the serpentine. And this she actually did. These scenes were enacted in the principal streets of the town, and the filthy announcements of the barkers were made in the presence of women and children. How scandalous. There were other reports of hucksters taking advantage of men in gambling bets. There was a game of chance that was described as using a pinch wheel. So let me explain what a pinch wheel is. It allows the operator to stop the wheel on a blank spot, thereby assuring that nobody could win on that particular bet. It was reported that one unlucky fellow lost $235 on that wheel. That was a heck of a lot of money in 1904. Soon the gamblers caught on, and the crooked wheel and its operators were chased out of town for fear of their lives. The Newcastle News reported, they ran through a hotel and out the rear way, escaping to the Lowell urban line, jumping aboard one of its cars as it was leaving town. What a sight that had to be, to see these men with wads of cash jumping on a streetcar just out of the clutches of a group of angry gamblers. Enjoying the village's alcoholic libations were also a part of the festive event, and there were some dust-ups reported, such as this eyewitness account reported in the Newcastle News. We visited the saloons and saw two hard fights, and in one a man was pretty done up. There was drinking and fighting everywhere, it seemed to me. I do not think that there were more than 200 people in the street where the fair was held, and many of them were boys. But the element on hand was certainly taking advantage of the opportunity to have the time of its life. I don't know about you, but it certainly sounds like a place I could have had the time of my life too. When it was all said and done, the fair organizers reported that they lost money on the event because they had provided too much free entertainment that was costly, but they vowed to do it again the following year. If there was a street fair in 1905, it must have been a much tamer affair because I certainly could not find anything in the newspapers about it. So let's move ahead to my favorite era in Lowellville's history, and this is what I call when booze was king. In 1911, something quite remarkable happened that would impact Lowellville for a decade. It was local option. Local option is when a county or town makes it illegal to sell or distribute alcohol for the purpose of consumption. And in 1911, Lowellville's neighbor to the west, Struthers, and the county to the east, Lawrence County, Pennsylvania, both went dry. When this happened, Lowellville's liquor trade flourished. So if any of you are from Newcastle and Struthers who are watching this, I have you to blame for what happened to my town back then. On Saturday nights, the streetcars traveling to and from Newcastle and Youngstown were packed full of men and a few women who came to town to have a few drinks and party at our establishments primarily located on Water, Washington, and Liberty Streets. And some even got a chance to spend an evening in our local jail to sleep off a night of too much imbibing on Lowellville's liquor. In 1912, the Newcastle News described the village as one of the rowdiest towns in the state. In the downtown section, there are saloons on every corner, the streets are filled with drunken men, and the lockup is usually full also. Business in town boomed, and to meet demand, the village jail increased its number of holding cells from a 20-person capacity to 40. And while the police force also grew it from 2 officers to 6. By 10 p.m. on a typical Saturday, the cells were filled up and night court was underway. Pickpockets and drunks made up most of the docket. If found guilty of intoxication, a defendant was fined $1 plus costs, which amounted to $4.85. For some of them, after paying their streetcar fare and for all their liquor, they couldn't pay their fines and were forced to work the next day cleaning or making repairs on the village streets in village-furnished white uniforms until their fines were satisfied, all while under the watchful eye of our village guards. A report by Marshal Tony Fisher in 1911 showed just how busy the police force were back then. 1,024 individuals were arrested for intoxication and disturbances in the previous year. Now, this is a town of 2,000 people. 2 years later, in 1913, the number of arrests would rise to 1,600. Wholesalers who sold wholesale liquor also had quite the business. They shipped, on average, 200 kegs out of Lowellville per day and 400 kegs on Saturdays. The good people of Lowellville were outraged for several years, and the option to make the village dry was placed on the ballot. Before an election, the wets and dries would vigorously promote their positions. And of course, the wets knew just how to encourage voters by serving drinks for votes. The dries, on the other hand, appealed to our villagers' moral convictions. And you can guess how the results turned out year by year. Most villagers decided to drink to a victory. I should mention that the moral elements in the village have been trying since the 1890s to vote the village dry, but they never succeeded. The closest they ever came was in 1913. The village had a dry mayor named Dr. Robert Erskine, and the dries were hopeful that things would finally be in their favor that year. The women in the village held prayer groups in support of the vote to dry the village up, and the wets held their breaths. The vote was close, 180 to 173 that year, but the wets prevailed once again. The Newcastle News had this to say about that wet victory. Persons who had worked indefatigably for the moist cause stood last night in groups with one foot on the brass rail and between gulps discussed the glories of victory. Lowellville firmly refuses to be legislated into righteousness. That's my town. Anyone want to guess as to when Lowellville finally did go dry? 1921, with the passage of the Volstead Act, which is actually prohibition. Well, let's just say Lowellville was almost dry. There were a number of bootleggers in the village who still offered alcohol to those who could not give up the drink. I do want to mention that if you're ever in Lowellville and you happen to be on the Stavich bike trail, that was actually the line for the old streetcar, the one that I mentioned that would bring people from Youngstown and Newcastle to Lowellville. So if you're ever on that bike trail, sit back, imagine as you're walking on that bike trail, all those trolley cars that came that way and brought visitors to the village of Lowellville. So the title of my book also includes murders. So I could not do this talk without talking about some of the murders that occurred in the village. I now want to take you back to 1913. 1913 was a very unlucky year in Lowellville. We had a gruesome double murder that occurred in a boxcar and a murder of a pretty young woman by her angry fiance. So let's start with that boxcar murder. On the morning of April 22nd, 1913, a gruesome discovery was made. 2 Polish immigrant rail workers were found butchered in a railroad boxcar. When the men were discovered, one was already dead and the other was just barely clinging to life. In April 1913, a crew of workers from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad were in town to repair the tracks which had been damaged by the big flood in March of 1913. On site were 3 boxcars located on the railroad siding near First Street, which served as temporary housing for the railroad crew. At 4 a.m., a cook named Tony Tortoise was trying to rouse these workers to come down and have breakfast. When he couldn't rouse them, he climbed the ladder to one of the boxcar openings to see what was going on, why the men didn't respond to his calls. When he peered into the boxcar, he saw that it was covered in blood, and he immediately called for help. When Lowellville officer Tom Driscoll investigated the scene, he found Marko Revich on his bunk, cut to pieces and barely alive, and Frank Starchy, whose skull was crushed, dead on his bunk. The Newcastle News described the incident as the foulest crime that ever occurred in this vicinity. Both men were about 30 years old, unmarried, and spoke very little English. They kept to themselves, and little was known about them. Revich was too injured to tell the officers what happened, and at first it was believed that this was a double murder, that someone had come and killed these men. Lowellville, as you can imagine, was in a state of panic. As a cautionary measure, the entire B&O crew who were put in jail as suspects, 3 Italians and 6 African Americans. A search for the killer commenced with bloodhounds brought in for tracking, but they quickly lost the scent. Within a few days, though, an unusual theory began to unfold. See, there was no blood found on the outside of the boxcar, and with the amount of blood on the inside, that just didn't seem to make sense. And the weapon, an adze, was found lying in the car near Revich. An adze looks a lot like a hatchet, but with a very long handle. There had been a pile of adzes laying in the corner of the car. It was evident that the men had been drinking heavily, as a case of beer that had been bought just that day was just about gone. Was it possible that maybe these two men killed each other? Revich was about 6 foot tall and a strong man. Starchy, the other, was of medium build. Starchy received a strong blow to the head which killed him, and Revich had a terrible facial wound with his lower jaw almost severed to the ear from a blow with that adze. The final theory of the case emerged. During a booze-induced argument between the two, Starchy, the smaller one, grabbed an adze from the corner and struck Revich across the face. And with the adrenaline rushing through Revich, he took that adze from Starchy and then struck him in the head and killed him. Revich, who suffered a great deal of blood loss, apparently fell back onto his bunk and was laying there, and he was just too weak to summon for help. No family or friends came to claim their remains, and both were buried in Lowellville Cemetery in our Potter's Field. So the next sad incident I want to tell you about is a story from also 1913. The village was just returning to normal after that double boxcar murder when another tragedy struck. Mary Sigmund was a pretty young 22-year-old Austrian immigrant. Mary came from Robinson Township, Pennsylvania, to work as a domestic in the no-goods saloon and boarding house. Mary had met another Austrian immigrant by the name of John Logar, who was a mill worker at the Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and he lived in Struthers. Soon the two fell in love and made plans to get married on May 31st, 1913. Unfortunately, things began to sour between Mary and John. Mary could be fickle, and John was known to be extremely jealous. Their relationship seemed to be over after a fierce quarrel, and Mary postponed the wedding. Apparently, on the day of their intended nuptials, the arguing between the two was very intense, and Marshal Tony Fisher was called to restore peace. Mary told Marshal Fisher that she wanted nothing more to do with John. John, who believed that Mary was ending their engagement, was enraged as well as heartbroken. He went out that very day and bought a gun. On Monday, June 2nd, 1913, Mary, who had the evening off, she was spending it with her sister Annie Drobenik. The two were enjoying a playful ride on a merry-go-round till about 9 o'clock. It began to get dark, so the two returned to the boarding house and found John there waiting for Mary. Mary and Annie walked by John and went into the rear of the boarding house into the kitchen. John was determined to see Mary, and he entered the building through the open door of the saloon in the front of the boarding house. When John entered the kitchen, Mary asked him to have a seat as she had intended to talk to him. John was extremely angry. He drew his gun and he shot Mary in the neck. As Mary attempted to escape, John shot her a second time in the back. Mary lay on the floor bleeding. Her sister Annie stood above her in disbelief. Agnes Nogood, who was Mary's employer, came into the kitchen to investigate the noise, and John Logar turned his gun on her, wounding her in the hip. Agnes somehow, even though as terrified as she was and wounded, ran out of the kitchen, up the steps to the porch, and began calling for help. John Logar turned and ran out of the kitchen onto the street. Marshal Tony Fisher was within earshot. He had been chatting with William Hertz, an officer from nearby Struthers. Both ran in the direction of the calls for help and were joined by off-duty police officer Tom Driscoll, who happened to be in the neighborhood. They spotted Logar running away and called for him to stop. He in turn just ran faster. One of the officers fired a warning shot into the air. This startled Logar, and he tripped and fell, and they were able to apprehend him. Mary and Agnes were both taken to Youngstown City Hospital. Agnes recovered, but Mary's condition only worsened. Peritonitis set in, and there was no medical miracle that could save that young girl's life. Her parents removed their daughter from the hospital and brought her to their home in Pennsylvania, where Mary died on June 18th, lingering for over 2 weeks after Logar had shot her. When questioned about why he shot Mary, his response was, "She fooled me, and I missed days of work because of her." He was charged with first-degree murder and held for trial. At trial in November 1913, he pled guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison. The last record I can find for John Logar is in the 1920 census, where he is listed as an inmate in the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus. Although I can't find a death record for him, it's safe to assume that he died in prison. Mary was buried in Petrie Cemetery near her family's home in Robinson Township. So now a little bit lighter, onto some what I call the Mayhem part of the book. My first story is about one of my favorite mayors, John Shannon Roller. Lowellville had a number of colorful mayors, and John Shannon Roller, or JS as he was known, is really my favorite former mayor. It was his antics in office that actually got him almost kicked out. On paper, John's credentials were impeccable. He was an attorney, and he had practiced law for over 50 years, and he had also been mayor of 2 other Ohio villages, Canfield and Washingtonville. He had been a solicitor for both Youngstown and Lowellville, and John was elected mayor in 1911 at the age of 71. But if you think that he was probably just a nice little old man, well, you would be mistaken. He was mayor when both Lawrence County and Struthers went dry, and Lowellville was its rowdiest. Because Mayor Roller was fond of the drink himself, he was seen to be too lenient with those who were charged with public drunkenness. Many in the village felt that he was not doing enough to keep the town from being overrun with drunks and pickpockets. In fact, he himself was accused of being on a continuous drunken jag. Here's an article describing what John's time in office was like, and this is from March 7th, 1913. The headline was, "Drunk Since New Year." John Roller of Lowellville is going to get a clean shirt, a shave, some new shoes, and a suit, and go appear before Governor Cox in Columbus on the charge of misconduct in office, which was filed against him by the members of the village council. He says that he had administered the office in proper manner and that people who make charges against him have nothing to say about his personal conduct. He appeared at the village office Wednesday morning with a black eye, which he explained was the result of contact with the janitor. The charges were filed after the mayor had gone forward in a church meeting and, according to reports, had attempted to kiss the preacher. The formal charges before the governor says that when he got drunk, he detailed a policeman to watch over him in the village jail. Other charges are that he has been drunk since January 1st. Roller was able to keep his job, and Governor Cox did not take any action to unseat him. However, after one term, the people of the village made it clear at the next election in 1913 that they wanted a dry mayor. So they elected Dr. Robert Erskine, known affectionately about town as Dr. Bob. He was a town physician who had campaigned on the platform to dry Lowellville up. Dr. Bob became mayor in 1914, and by the following year, he had had enough of the town drunks, including, believe it or not, former Mayor Roller. Here's another article, and this is from July 3rd, 1915. Former mayor is under arrest. Mayor Robert Erskine of Lowellville yesterday ordered the town marshal to clear the mayor's office and the council chamber of the village of the chronic loafers and drunks who are said to have congregated in the building early each morning. The marshal was told to place the accused in the village jail at the rear of the town hall. Among those locked up on a charge of drunkenness was ex-mayor John S. Roller of Lowellville. He was charged with being one of the loafers in the town hall. So far I've shared some of the murders, a bit of the mayhem, but I want to share one last story. And this is the more part of Murders, Mayhem, and More. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that Lowellville was just an awful, wicked little town. There were many pretty funny stories that made the news here, and here is one of them. This happened in July 1914, and I'm going to read this story exactly how it was written because the reporter who wrote this story was very talented, in my opinion. The headline read, "Poor Bossy is fed on poison." The big things in life often has small beginnings was brought home to Stephen Ritz, a young Polander of Lowellville yesterday, when he was locked in the village jail for the night. And now, as he dolefully looks back over the events of the last few weeks, he traces his arrest directly to the mooing of an invalid cow. For some time, the feelings between Steve and Mary Nyatsko, a neighbor, were strained. Although his family and hers had formerly been the best of friends, the breach widened. There were criminations and recriminations. Then the climax came when a cow belonging to Mary suddenly became mysteriously ill, and with eyes turned forlornly heavenward, bellowed aloud its appeal for help. Mary answered the call with all human kindness and found Bossy walking the fields with the restlessness of a man who had been eating overripe lobsters, or a boy who had partaken a peck of green apples with not enough salt to take out the aches. Noting the symptoms, Mary at once jumped to the conclusion that her favorite had been poisoned, and with Burns-like deduction, decided that no one else but Stephen would plan such a covert attack. Next came a hurried call to a Newcastle veterinarian to relieve Bossy's pain, and at the same time, a shout for the police to haul Steve off to jail. Steve, however, strenuously denies any dastardly attempt on the life of the cow and declares he knows nothing at all of the quantity of lye said to have been found in the shady nooks where Bossy wont to ruminate. He nevertheless was brought before Mayor Robert Erskine yesterday on a charge of disturbance, all of which revolved about that first faint mooing, and after telling his story was fined $10 and costs, or in all $19.75. Since much technical evidence was necessarily introduced. Not having the money, he is obliged to spend a good part of his summer in jail, while Bossy, now fully recovered from her tummy ache, is peacefully switching flies on the meadow near her mistress's home. Over the last 7 years, I have gained such an appreciation for my hometown and the folks before me who have made it their home too. Every time I find another story, I'm amazed that such a small village can have so much history. It's a history about the people who once inhabited one small place in a corner of Mahoning County. Not the kind of history I learned about in school that consisted of learning about the dates of famous battles and the places that meant nothing to me. The history I uncovered really struck with me. It was about my home, my people, and I just couldn't get enough of it. So today I still spend hours a week seeking the stories of those who have long been forgotten. We genealogists have a saying, a person is not really dead as long as there is someone here on earth to speak their name. So thank you for allowing me to speak their names today and to share with you the rich history of my hometown of Lowellville, Ohio. If you have stories or old photos of Lowellville that you would like to share, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me via email at lowvillehistory@gmail.com. And if you'd like to read more about stories about Lowellville, you can buy a copy of my book here at the Tyler History Center's gift shop or at Ross's Market in Lowellville on Liberty Street or online at amazon.com. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roslyn, for that most interesting presentation. Thank you all for watching today, and we hope you join us again on Thursday, August 20th for our next program in Bites and Bits of History, which will be Shall Not Be Denied, a history of the women's suffrage movement with our own Tracy Manning.